Well, up until a week ago, it was rainy and wet around here, and as I threw away bucket loads of water from washing veggies, it hurt. Not just in thinking about the waste from an environmental standpoint, but from a very personal standpoint. Last summer, we had a major heat wave here in Portland. Watering the garden was more expensive than prior years. Now I've been throwing buckets of it away. I also get tons of rain just coming down on me, and I haven't done the work to capture any of that. So it hurts, you know. I feel that there's an investment I could have made that would have saved me money, been better for the environment, and provided me with a better water source for the garden. Some say rainwater is better than city water for the plants, and the concept makes sense to me, but I haven't fully vetted that. Anyway, for me, it's really just a lost opportunity that is literally down the drain. A few weeks back, a viewer requested that I talk about how I go about watering such a large garden here. I have to answer that question in two ways. There's how I watered over the last few years, and then there's how I'm planning to water this year. So starting with what I've done in the last few years. I've set up overhead sprinklers around this garden. I have about 10, well not about, exactly 10 different zones across the whole property. They're not on timers. I turn them on manually while I'm out in the garden doing things. They're relatively easy setup. I don't have a permanent irrigation lines of any sort. I have 1/2 inch black poly tubing that goes from faucets to the sprinklers with ball valve switches that turn the sprinklers on and off. Now I bet some of you are surprised or think I'm crazy because of using overhead sprinklers. It totally sounds antithetical to the popular way most home gardeners think about watering. Some water by hand, and you often hear the praises of drip systems. And I'm here just flat out using an overhead sprinklers, to spray water everywhere almost indiscriminately. Well, given my cost of water during last year's heat wave, I'm definitely rethinking this. But as I'll explain, I'm not going to completely ditch the sprinklers. I've set up drip systems in the past. I'm not a big fan of having the drip system tubing everywhere, and I know you can bury it or you can do other things to hide it, but one of the primary problems I have with drip systems is the fact that I grow a lot of annuals, both flowers and vegetables. I'm always moving where those things are planted from season to season, and sometimes within the same season. That leads to moving and redoing the setup for the drip system emitters every season, at least. I've used a combination of the little sprinklers that plug into drip system lines as well as the actual drip emitters that you can get. After that, there were inevitable dead zones that I'd have to go back and rearrange or add emitters when I set them up in the past. I had much less garden space previously, about 200 square feet or so, and even at that scale, it took hours, tens of hours in some years, to get the whole thing set up. Now I have roughly 2,500 square feet of garden space when you think about all the beds. In my old, smaller garden, I would barely get the drip system arranged in time for the 2 months we usually have heat and only little rain, July and August. So I felt like the drip system in my garden is a little bit overkill. It's too detailed, it's too specific, it's just too much. Yeah, the sprinkler wastes some water, but it wastes water because it hits paths, not just the beds, but I'm only running it July and August. Now last year was a little bit crazy. I have to admit that I did spend way more money than anticipated. You know, we had a heat wave and a longer dry period that started much earlier in the year. I was using the sprinklers for an extra month and a half or so. However, I had other issue watering that used up a lot of water. I was messing around with the garden stream, a water feature here in the garden. I couldn't figure out how to keep the water in it while it was running. I was constantly filling the stream at least every other day. That's like filling about 2 bathtubs worth of water every other day. To make matters worse, I forgot and left the water overfilling the stream all night a couple of times last year. Well, that really skewed my water bill numbers, so it's hard for me to know exactly how much was from extra water of the garden beds versus that episode of dealing with the garden stream. Prior to last year, without having the heat dome, my water bill might be an extra $100 to $200, maybe even $300 in July and August. I'm not a very frugal gardener, as you've probably seen around here. I'm afraid to admit that, but there are lots of folks out there that do a great job of that. You can find it on YouTube. It's just not me. I spend a lot of money on things like compost, cedar chips, garden gadgets of all kinds, and even, believe it or not, garden help. part-time garden help, but we do still have weeds around here. So my point with that is, in the grand scheme of things, a few $100s of extra water because of using the sprinklers, when it saves me time like it did, up until last year, that was kind of a minor cost relative to the other costs that we have around here. I've been pretty inspired watching master gardeners do a lot of hand watering. Some just use the hose. Charles Downing actually hand waters using watering cans. There's a YouTube gardener on the East Coast, Gary Pilarczyk, who gardens in Maryland. He talks about watering in more than one of his videos. One of the points that he made recently, which resonates with me, is that you need to deep water, yes, of course, but you also have a lot of plants that have surface roots, and you need to keep those happy and hydrated as well. So he recommends a combination of surface watering and deep watering, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Deep watering seems to be a popular topic around here. I see it discussed often in Facebook groups on gardening. The idea thrown around is that if you deep water less often than surface watering daily, for example, you encourage roots to grow down and the plants to establish better and more resilience. I'm thinking to have optimal hydration in your garden, you want a combination of both deep watering and some surface watering. I'm somewhat skeptical of the fervor for deep watering in lieu of more frequent watering because I do grow a lot of annuals. Many of the vegetables in the garden I have are designed to be there for 60 to 90 days. When it comes to my whole season, heat-loving crops like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and winter squash, the idea of building deep root systems makes a bit more sense to me. These kind of summer crops I plant as early as I can, usually by June, and then they're going to stay in the ground through October. However, building a deep root system under shorter term crops like lettuce, arugula, and maybe even beets and zucchinis, I don't quite get that. For example, I just got my zucchini in the ground and they're going to be out of the ground within 2 months. So why am I trying to build a deep root system for something that's only in the ground for such a short period? I think the deep watering to create deep root systems in your garden makes perfect sense for perennials. With the perennials and the trees and the bushes, things that are going to be coming back year after year, you're building a long-term root system, a good foundation infrastructure for those plants. That totally makes perfect sense to me. Last year, hearing about deep watering, I tried to do it with the sprinklers by leaving them on longer than I previously had. In retrospect, I don't think that's a good plan because it increases the error rate of watering paths that don't need watering. That's the change that I'm making this year. I'm going to do the deep watering by hand with the hose or with watering cans, depending on where it is. Then I'm going to use the sprinklers to do some surface watering in between. I'm currently thinking, subject to change based on what I see and feel in the soil, that I'll do deep watering, say, once a week, and surface watering with the sprinklers a couple of times in between. With the sprinklers, I don't have them on a timer or anything automated. I'm out in the garden every day, so it's easy enough for me to just turn on a zone while I'm doing other things in the garden, and that allows me to maximize my gardening time. So I started my new watering philosophy around here this weekend, and we've finally been dry for several days, and we look over this week to have no rain in the forecast. Over this previous week, we've had several days of 80-degree temperatures, and now it's in the 90s, almost 100 for a couple of days here at PDX Garden Home. I'm going to water the pots daily by hand using watering cans, but I'm not going to do all the deep watering with the watering cans. I can't go full Charles Downing on it. When you deep water, you want to get about 2 to 3 inches of water on the plant or in the root zone. That typically you can figure out the 2 to 3 inches by filling a bucket with your hose or with your watering can and seeing how long it takes as you're filling to get to 2 to 3 inches of water in that bucket. For me, using the hose, it comes out to about 10 seconds of spraying on the root zone. Another angle on this topic of watering is, how do I know when to water? I'm thinking it's probably a deep watering once a week and surface watering a couple of times in between, depending on how the soil feels. But what do I mean by how the soil feels? Well, that's a tricky part, and I picked this rule of thumb up from watching other YouTube gardeners. I'll give a shout out here to Angela Baker, who has a YouTube channel called Park Rose Permaculture. She is in my area. She has kind of a different style of gardening than I do, but she's a wealth of information. I'm sure she has probably talked about watering in her videos or more than one of her videos, but she's also very active on the local Facebook gardening groups. And I saw her answer this question just the other day. And so you stick your finger in 2 knuckles down, right? And then if there's still moisture within that zone, then you probably don't need to water. I've heard that same adage before, and it was a good reminder. I use it in my garden here. As I mentioned earlier, it's been in the 80s the last couple of days, and it's the high 90s this weekend. But all of my beds had moisture within the 2 knuckle zone. The only thing that didn't have moisture that maybe needed watering were the pots. We've had an amazing amount of rain up until the last week, and the ground has just been saturated. So during the hottest part of the day, some of the plants will wilt and they'll look a little bit sad. And you might be thinking that they need water, but they don't necessarily, because if you stick your finger down in there and you can tell that it's moist in the 2 knuckle zone, those plants are probably just responding to the direct harsh sun on them. And as soon as that sun is off them later in the evening, they'll bounce back and look fine. So I'm not doing a complete watering this weekend, despite the fact that we're in 90 to 100 degree weather. I'll check again tomorrow what the moisture levels are looking like. I think things might be starting to dry up, but my guess is I probably won't water for a couple of days at this rate. Well, I hope you found me sharing my watering plan in this garden helpful as you think about what you're going to do in your garden. Every garden is a little bit different. If you like this video, keep in mind I post weekly. Please like and subscribe, and I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. It really means the world to me that you're joining me here in the garden.